Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and I want to talk about doing cool things. Now, I want you to be able to do the coolest stuff you want to do in Warcry. But before you can do that, I've got to give you some warnings. And this is something that I really love about collectible strategy games is that the sort of base theory from one game translates really well into another game. Something that I've commented on a few times is it's really scary how good kill team players are at Warcry. In fact, they're usually better at Warcry than Warcry players are. Like, usually a kill team player in their third game of Warcry is like an above average Warcry player, once they've gotten the hang of the rules, because a lot of that stuff translates, right? And so I want to talk about one of the most fundamental articles of collectible strategy game theory that ever happened, really, in Magic the Gathering, and how it translates to Warcry before I can talk to you about how we can just like send two middle fingers its way. The article is called The Danger of Cool Things, and it's incredibly historic. It's 25 years old at this point. Just to kind of define the terms here, cool being like both awesome stuff and fancy stuff, and then danger being sort of the way those things distract us. And sort of where is our focus? Are we focusing on the cool thing or on the mission at hand? The article itself kind of goes through a few stories about trying to show off, times that the author tried to show off and lost because of it, and times when another player, this is a really funny thing that happens in the Magic community. It actually still happens. It's just part of the culture of that game, is that top level players are perfectly willing to call out other top level players and be like, so and so would win more or like lost this tournament because of X, and they clearly should change the way they play to account for that, which I don't know very many other, certainly none of the kind of GW tabletop games that I've played have communities where people would be super comfortable with that. But it reflects a kind of low sentimentality about outcomes that exists in Magic that not everyone would love, but I do think there's a lot to be learned from it. Sometimes you win a game because you did something cool, and those games are unforgettable. But you can then lose a bunch of games trying to chase that high, which I think is something I've seen a lot and very interesting. I think one of the last takeaways the article leaves you with is, above all, take the time to check what you are doing. Make sure you aren't giving unnecessary chances to your opponent, and don't be fancy for its own sake. I don't know if that's the definition of cool, fanciness for its own sake, but I do think it's a good piece of advice if what you want to do is win some games. And I think my personal takeaway is that, and this is something that I think is worth keeping in mind all the time, especially as I'm about to make an entire video about how to get as cool and weird as you can, as successfully as you can. But the danger of cool things is when fixated by the prospect of doing something cool, you misapply your focus, leading to errors and lost games. And I see this happen all the time, especially in Warcry, where a lot of people want to do kind of crazy, weird stuff. I've certainly lost games because of trying to do cool things, and I don't know very many people who haven't, really. So how does this kind of apply to Warcry? We can kind of get specific here. There's crazy abilities in the game, some of which are very good, some of which are just kind of cool, right? I've seen a lot of people, for example, pretend that their faction quad is better than Rampage in a certain situation, when, of course, we all know no faction quad is ever better than Rampage. You can also kind of chase big damage combos. Like, Brewgate got really played for a reason. The Oss Effector is kind of sweeping the nation right now. It's very popular. You can also kind of get really focused into a sweet theme, something like Oops All Korgoraths or Oops All Brutes was one of my most popular lists in 1.0 way back in the day. Even something like Check Out How I Painted These Shields can be kind of a theme. That's one of the great things about tabletop games is that you can paint your models into a really cool theme, and so you can have a fairly pedestrian, like mechanically pedestrian warband that's still just so cool because you've taken such a weird theme with how you painted them. You can also kind of get fixated on a pet model. For example, I need to quit the Exalted Deathbringer. I play it way too much. It's not very good, but I just think it's so cool. I think the model is cool. Like the pose he's in is so cool. So I've played him a ton and lost because of it. So that's at least an example for myself. Basically, this is kind of all in the eye of the beholder, but my definition of cool isn't necessarily fanciness for its own sake. My definition of cool is I just think this is neat. Now, I want to defend cool things because I think the tone of that article, I think that article is really important, but the tone of it is that, cool is a little bit like being too cute. And I want to get to, why do we play games? Do we play to experience, express, or prove something? Like that's the Timmy, Johnny, Spike theory of why to play games. Now, Magic R&D actually, they're the ones who popularized those terms. They don't even use them anymore. They used them all throughout the 2000s, the early part of the 2010s, but they don't do it anymore. They've kind of expanded it because there's lots of other reasons you play, right? You can play to escape. You can play to meet people. You can play to have fun. There's all sorts of different things. We're not all just chasing kind of the same idea here. And so why not just play to maximize your own enjoyment, right? And if doing cool stuff is what does that for you, who cares if you lose some games because of it? Now, this is something where you need to be sort of clear-eyed and sober about what that means. But you can still have fun. At the end of the day, I think most players would rather 3-1 with a theme they love than 4-0 with something that they don't like. Now, obviously, everyone would like to 4-0 every event they take, but that's not true at all. I actually start feeling guilty. The times I've 4-0'd 2 events in a row, I've had this weird crisis of confidence and felt really guilty about myself. But I do think most players really enjoy 3-1ing with their pet models. I think that's kind of the dream. Now, I do think, kind of against that, if you paint a net list, if you kind of just Google what's winning right now and you build the models and paint the models, I think you'll probably fall in love with them by the time you put them on the table. So that is kind of a different sort of tweak about tabletop gaming that's kind of generally true. But usually most people are okay with maybe having a slightly less high win rate if that means that they get to play something they love, to enjoy the game to its maximum. So let's talk about how to do that effectively, right? How to actually make your cool things work. I'm going to kind of talk sort of first at the 40,000 foot view level and then get down into the weeds, right? Kind of zoom in as we go through the video. The first thing I think you should focus on for whatever cool thing it is that you want to do. I mean, again, remember Tom Cruise with his risky business. Whatever that means to you, zoom in. What kind of setup does your cool thing need if it's not one of the better things in the game? Are you targeting an ally, self, or an enemy? What ranges are we looking at? And then what does the cool thing do for you? If it does damage, what shape is that damage? For example, let me kind of explain the way you need to set up damage that kind of goes straight through armor. Like, let's say you have a burn spell that you really love, or your favorite pet model, its ability is a burn spell. That is something where you have to have a certain range. Knight Arcanum has 18-inch range, so I'm not too worried about the setup. But the damage is interesting because it goes in multiples of 3 and it ignores armor. But it's not exactly overwhelming in terms of amount, right? So the shape of that damage going in multiples of 3 makes it something where I really want to, if I can, be activating my Knight Arcanum last, because it's really good at picking off models that have 3 or 6 damage left. Now, it's not the worst if you just try to burn down a chaff model with it and hope that you get 9 damage on an 8 wound fighter. I mean, that has happened for me before, but it's not very likely. I mean, it's a 12.5% chance, even if you've got rolling 6 dice. So the shape of that damage matters, right? Because you're really looking to use it to just say, no fighter that goes down to 3 wounds is going to survive to the next round against my warband, right? That's a cool thing for a Knight Arcanum to be able to say, right? But it does mean that that changes how you play it. Whereas if the shape of the damage is just a massive attack step, right? If this is a self-damage buff for its own attack, that's very different, right? That's going to be a lot more damage, but it's going to depend on the attack profile, right? Let's say you've got a strength 5 fighter, you're doing venom encrusted weapons. I'm just kind of picking a kiloboss out of thin air, right? So a kiloboss is, I think, 5-4-2-4. Venom encrusted makes it 5-4-3-5. Hopefully I remember to put the kiloboss profile up here. But that 3-5 is really exciting. You probably want to think about maybe blessing strength if what you really care is making your kiloboss that you worked really hard to paint play really well, and then trying to hit as many times as you can. So you want to be sort of setting up by running him into combat kind of early, like round 1, and then just trying to get as many attack steps as you can in rounds 2 and 3, hopefully against things that aren't strength or toughness 6, right? So just kind of some very basic examples there to show you what I mean, but just being honest with yourself about what it is actually doing and how that affects how you're going to have to play the model. If it's control instead of damage, you need to think about what types of fighters are weak to the disruption that you're doing, and what types of fighters can ignore it. So, for example, I've seen a lot of people play nets, for example, and get really into the idea that they're just going to net whatever, right? I think the Splintered Fang Trueblood is a really popular target for this. The Trueblood is really amazing for just invalidating one massive fighter, but I don't really think it has a few issues, right? So one, if you don't get initiative, you are kind of in a tough spot, which means you are under a ton of pressure to bank your wild dice round 1. So you need to have extreme discipline with that. It's rarely going to be worth it to, say, upgrade something into a quad to get a sweet rampage round 1, if that means that you won't be able to control initiative later in the game, which means your Trueblood will just be bad. And it also means, because of that you kind of don't want to have your Trueblood in the same list as an Alpha Striking Rampager, right? Something like, something that is pretty fast, like a Juggerlord from Khorne, right? You probably don't want to play your Juggerlord and your Trueblood in the same list, because a Juggerlord loves the opportunity to get a rampage turn 1 and just fly across the board and go attack something and take it out. That means you're not going to really control initiative for the rest of the game, but it does mean you're going to get some damage in, which is kind of cool. So just don't play that and the Trueblood in the same list, for example. They're just not friends. So kind of think about what types of fighters are weak, what types of situations does that put you in, right? And that can really help you just kind of get the most out of it. The other things to talk about are kind of, what are the cool things' real weaknesses? What disrupts cool thing? What just completely ignores the cool thing? And then what else goes into winning a Warcry game that your cool thing doesn't contribute to? So, for example, if you have something that, say, like a brute boss, for some reason I'm picking a brute boss is more of a competitive piece. Trueblood is maybe more in the cool range, but it's all kind of in the eye of the beholder. If you think that brute bosses are the coolest, then this works, right? But a brute boss has Umesen, and Umesen is a really cool ability where you can make all their chaff stuff just not matter on objectives. But there's a lot that goes into winning a Warcry game that a brute boss just doesn't contribute to, right? It's very slow, so it's never going to win a race to a treasure. It is it has a tough time winning fights against really big things. Even though it has Duff Up the Big Thing, it's kind of killable by a lot of the really big scary things in the game. So it's very good at winning objectives against very specific warbands, but it can really kind of have a tough time against some other things too. So you want to have, say, some fast things in your warband if you're playing a brute boss. You want to have sort of things that help you deal with mid-sized stuff. Like, for example, other orcs are going to be annoying. So, like, a brute boss doesn't really want to see an opposing Cruel Boys list because Cruel Boys are just kind of cheaper and also 15 wounds than what the brute boss is going to have. Stuff like that. Then think, what does Cool Thing contribute when it doesn't do the thing? So, for example, you picked a fighter with an incredible triple, like Calthea Zandire, and then you just roll a straight, and you just can't get a triple. What is Calthea doing for you? She has her move 5, and she is pretty decent at killing chaff, but that's kind of it. And she actually, for her points, she can kind of die a little quicker than you want her to. Even though toughness 5 is nice, 25 wounds is nice. She doesn't just like fall apart. But if you do go chase the chaff with your move 5, sometimes you can overextend her. You can get her too far away from the friends that she's trying to accelerate down the line, and you can put her in a situation where she's almost dead. You're not getting the benefit even when you do get the triple because they take it out in the next round, and then you just kind of misapply her throughout the game, something like that. So you have to kind of think about, if I can't overextend her to try to do the thing she's good at, which is killing chaff, how upset am I in a situation where I don't roll the right initiative roll? The other thing is, like, for example, you had no choice but to grab a treasure with your combo enabler, and now you can't really move it into range to do its thing, right? So, for example, if the whole reason you took Jags the Bleeder or something, like from that Underworld's warband. So the whole reason you took him is because you want to leave people bleeding, because you think that leave you bleeding ability is like the funniest thing you've ever heard. Well, you grab a treasure with him, you can't just run him into combat, right? So now you're thinking, okay, what is this kind of move 4 15 wound guy doing for me? Am I happy that I paid the points that I did for him, etc.? Right? Think about what is the fail state for your fighter. Then there's a couple other things. Once you kind of go through that, it kind of makes me think a lot, because sometimes, a lot of the time, the thing that's good in a meta is just a cool thing run amok, right? So, for example, I kept thinking of examples that were actually just really strong fighters, like Brute Boss and Calthea, right? Things that have been kind of meta staples for a while. And I think a big part of that is a lot of the things that are really strong in the game have very cool things to them, whether it's just like a wild profile in some way. Like Vexmore has like an incredibly silly, funny profile that is really exciting to read. Or the Brugit, where Loonshine Potion is just the most hilarious ability you can pull off. If you've never heard of Brugit before, if you've never seen people play Brugit lists before, and you just read the Brugit ability, you're just like, oh man, that's the funniest thing I've ever seen. I can't wait to play it. Fight for Profit is like the old version of Fight for Profit, where you could boost your guns if you were, on an objective or holding treasure, making money, essentially. That ability was like the perfect way to encapsulate everything that Caradron Overlords is about. There's also like pet meta was a thing that happened in Warcry 1.0, where just like all the cute pets, they made them good because people love cute pets, so you want to get to play your cute pets. And then the thing became to spam pets because like they were too good, and they were all cheap because they were little. So like little spiders, Potgrots were completely broken. Aetherwings were completely broken. The giant rat in Skaven, which was just like a little mouse that you put on a base, that was completely broken, right? Those things were just kind of cool things. Like, people love pets, right? But they just kind of run amok and they become the good thing. This is good game design and bad game development, essentially, because one of the things that Mark Rosewater wrote in his 20 Lessons from 20 Years of Game Design was that ideally, the correct strategies in your game are the most fun strategies. So ideally, you have a game and you have figured out, what you think is the most enjoyable thing about the game, but the game is bigger than that. You kind of push the things that you think your players will enjoy the most. You try to make the game be about those things, so that usually the thing is kind of is going to be fun, right? That's the idea, is you make it fun. And so I wonder, is there a difference between a cool thing and a good thing? I mean, one benefit to this is that usually if you read an ability and it sounds really amazing, it's usually possible to make it work. And that's part of the point of this video. But it also makes me wonder, like, are cool things countercultural by definition? Like, if something that I think is cool, if I go win a tournament with it and then I tell you all it's really good, does that make it uncool by me telling you? It's just something worth thinking about. I don't know. There's no strategy there. It's just worth thinking about. Tell me in the comments if you start to think things are uncool if they're very powerful. So once you've got your cool thing and you've thought about what its strengths and weaknesses are, you know more about this cool thing than anyone else who plays your game. Does that mean you're right about it? I don't think it does. And we can go back to our article on the danger of cool things to just quickly talk about it. Because it's really easy to lie to yourself, especially about your favorite things in the game. I mean, these games, these collectible strategy games, they become part of our identity, right? And so very few people are fully self-aware about their own identity. Almost no one is. So let's go back to the article. He talks about Verdant Force, which was a deck at the time. It was centered around the most beautiful piece of art. And Verdant Force was all about just cheating this weird little gremlin troll, swamp troll, into play. He's actually not a troll. He's an elemental, but I mean, look at him. He's a Fellwater Trogoth, with a really strong card called Natural Order, which is still strong to this day. It's played quite a bit in competitive Magic still, even though it's like a 30-year-old card. In it, he kind of talked about, in the article, he talked about Jamie Wakefield, who was a legendary player at the time, who was really into Verdant Force, he was kind of a player whose results were like just below the pros. And the reason it was that way was because he would play cool decks, and Verdant Force was a very cool deck. I mean, look at the art. Of course it's a cool deck. At the time, Pox was the most popular deck. It was every pro was going around saying that Pox is the best deck in the format. You don't need to know what Pox does to understand this. Basically, Jamie had a whole set of matchups that he would write about and tell people about, and like, this card beats that card, and this card in Verdant Force beats that card in Pox, and doing this idea in Verdant Force beats that idea in Pox. And the author of The Danger of Cool Things kind of went through and was like, yes, this card beats that card, but it doesn't beat that or that card. And this line of play, sure, it beats like this plan A of Pox, but Pox has a plan B, and plan B completely invalidates this. And like, it's just really easy to tell yourself that your cool thing beats the evil meta thing, when in fact it really just has some game against the evil meta thing. And so once you're done kind of figuring out what you want to do with your cool thing, if you're worried about a certain player who you know is going to show up to a tournament with a certain strategy, or you're worried about a certain faction that's very popular, ask yourself, like, if you reversed the chairs, how would you attack your cool thing with their list, right? Um, this was something I used to hear a lot when Caradron Overlords was dominant in Warcry, just a few months ago. Would be like, I can beat KO by doing this. And I would always think to myself, and sometimes I would actually ask the person, like, okay, that plan makes sense. But if you were KO and someone told you, hey, you're going to be playing against this warband and this is what it does, could you adjust your strategy to beat it? And most of the time, if the person was being honest with themselves, the answer would be yes, they could, right? That's why KO was too good, was because you could just adjust your positioning, you could adjust your strategy to beat all kinds of different sort of counterplay to KO. And that's what made KO so good. So, like, make sure that you reverse the chairs. That doesn't mean that it invalidates your cool thing, that you shouldn't play your cool thing, but it just lets you go in with kind of clear eyes. And a quick addendum to this, I asked Kyle Knapp this question once, and he ended up thinking, and then he goes, it'd be 50-50. And that's a great place to be, because he essentially concluded, like, a great KO player, a good KO player, is still going to beat me half of the time, but I'm probably going to get them most of the time if they haven't practiced with their list, if they don't kind of understand the metagame outside of just like har KO burn stuff. And I think he was completely satisfied with that answer. But I think it's a question you have to ask yourself, and then you get to decide, are you cool with that being the situation or not? And then the second thing there, once you've done that, that can really help you avoid toxicity when your cool thing isn't good enough. Because a lot of the time that's going to be true. If you try to do something crazy, sometimes it's going to work, and sometimes it's not. And that's okay, right? The thing that you really need to avoid doing, and there's an AOS content creator who I think has been really incredible at kind of explaining this. His name's Heywo Twitch, but I'll try to do it in my own way. You can say, it sucks that my sweet strategy isn't rewarded when your stupid strategy gets to be number one. That's like an easy thing to think to yourself when you lose doing something you think is so sweet and you lose to like a strategy that you don't like. But just try to remember, if your cool thing loses, you get to play cool thing. You don't have to play cool thing. You get to. We're all just playing games. We're incredibly privileged that we live in societies with leisure time and that we have enough money to play Warhammer. I mean, even cheap proxies are expensive compared to a lot of other hobbies. And the amount of time it takes to paint models. I mean, it's just, if you get to go to a tournament and play a tabletop war game, you're so lucky, right? You get to play cool thing. So just remember that. No one made you show up with the thing you think is cool. Now I want to get into a real example. And this is the fighter that, in all of Warcry, it's the bad fighter that I like the most. Yes, I said Exalted Deathbringer, but Exalted Deathbringer doesn't make for as interesting a video because Knight Relictor has a really cool ability. It's a triple, which already means it has to be incredible to actually be competitively viable. And the ability isn't quite incredible, but it does really do a thing. Until the end of the battle round, subtract 1 from the damage points allocated by each hit and critical hit, to a minimum of 1, from attack actions that target friendly fighters while they are within 6 inches of this fighter. There's a few cool things here. 1, the Purifying Incense comes from the most ridiculous looking incense bearer I have ever seen. It's half skull, half thimble for some reason, and he's holding it on a chain. I absolutely adore it. He's got more incense in his little box. He's an armored paladin with a mace, and he's just got an incense box that he's strapped to his tummy. I mean, that's amazing, right? Now, he takes kind of a lot of setup, right? He has to be on an important part of the battlefield, and you have to have fighters within 6 inches of him. And he's only move 4, which means that he's not move 3, so he can get around, but he has to kind of really focus on getting around. And sometimes you'll need to spend one round like rushing to get him there, and then you can do purifying incense later, stuff like that. But one thing that's cool about it, and what he does, is first of all, to get really simple, he makes it difficult to remove your fighters with attack actions, right? Of course, this doesn't affect abilities, but it's very good at nerfing attack actions. Against a lot of fighters, going -1/-1 will reduce their damage more than just reducing it by one attack will. And that lets you, if you have a lead, it lets you protect that lead, which makes him terrible in Stormcast, because Stormcast are they come from behind every game, right? They kind of lose early points, and then they win through the fact that they don't die as much as the opponent, and they eventually chip away at what the opponent has set up. Knight Relictor is trying to play the exact opposite game of the rest of Stormcast, which I kind of love, and again, is part of what makes him so cool to me. The other thing that's cool is most of the defensive auras, they don't protect against shooting. You can just stand outside the bubble and shoot into the bubble and just kill everything in it. Knight Relictor, no. He actually does protect you from shooting, because it just matters if the targets are within 6 inches from him. It doesn't matter if the shooter is, right? It's purifying incense. It's your friends are smelling it. It's the oh, is that chai spice? Oh, I love that. That's what's protecting your friends, which is really awesome that he actually protects you from shooting. And a lot of the best shooters in the game are actually really out of luck when they're shooting into his bubble, right? Like Slan Starmaster is probably the scariest shooter in the game. It has a 3/6 damage profile. When you go down to 3/5/2/4, that's a lot less frightening. He also basically invalidates the 4/4/2/4 profile, which a lot of people are running similar profiles to that on a couple fighters in warbands, right? It's just that profile is so common. I mean, that's even his attack profile, right? That profile is so common, but it just like kind of pops up, even though it's not usually very good. It pops up a lot, and this guy basically completely invalidates it, which I think is really useful and really cool. So yes, his ability is on a double, it would be crazy good, and on a triple, it's just not quite as impactful as the competitive level triples that are in the game. But I think it's sweet, and the fact that he's worth kind of a 2.5 pull puts him in a tough spot, but that's cool, right? I was going to do this section on the Lord of Hubris, for example, but the Lord of Hubris is like a little too strong to really illustrate what I mean. So then let's get into kind of the negatives with him. One, the opponent can play around it if they win initiative. And this is even true of a lot of the really strong fighters that people try to break in competitive play. A lot of the time when you are entirely focused on sort of dominating with abilities, sometimes if you lose initiative, everything can just come apart for you. And so I think it's really important to have a lot of fighters in your warband that are sort of good enough that they don't mind losing initiative, right? Like stats don't care about initiative, abilities do. And so I think it's really important to have a balance of fighters with good stats and fighters with good abilities if you really want to maximize your chances of winning. Another weakness of the Knight Relictor, 4/8 and 5/10 damage profiles just completely shrug it off. He just does nothing to them, right? So you need to think in your lists about how you're going to deal with those. Now, one is you could just dodge them, right? Not everyone plays 4/8 and 5/10 damage profiles in the game. But one of the reasons why I don't think Knight Relictor is competitively viable is because just with the math of how GW set up the points for this edition, 4/8 and 5/10 damage profiles tend to be more damage efficient than just like they literally just cost less than the damage they do compared to fighters with lots of attacks that do less damage. And there's counter. And so 4/8 and 5/10 damage profiles have kind of become, for most of 2.0, they've been kind of the best thing you can be doing. A lot of them did get nerfed recently, but the game still really encourages you to have high impact hits. And have at least one fighter in your warband with very high impact hits. And so that's kind of a tough place for Knight Relictor to be just from a meta consideration. So you're going to want to run it in warbands that aren't too worried about 4-8 and 5-10. So you can have some nets, right? Really big fighters are often somewhat weak to nets. You can have kind of other kind of cute disruption abilities that are kind of single target. Or one thing you can do is 12 wound models. All of a sudden, 4-8 profiles don't shrug off his ability because now instead of killing something in 3, it takes 4 now. Like instead of 3 dice, it takes 4 dice to take them out if he's done his ability. So that's actually kind of nice to have. Lastly, the fail state of this guy is essentially you just get a tanky hero with a terrible attack profile. I mean, 4424 is really good when it's on like a 110 point fighter, but on a 180 point fighter, it's just not good enough. But he is very hard to kill, right? Toughness 5, 28 wounds. That's your fail state. Is you have a hero who's tough to kill, who can kind of hold down a point. He's actually very good at holding a treasure, for example, because he's not very fast, but T5, 28 wounds, if they don't get started pretty early in the game, they can be completely out of luck. If he's unblemished in round 4 holding a treasure, they're not killing him, right? It takes more than one round, unless you kind of overextend with him. It takes more than one round to kill a Knight Relictor, and that's kind of the positive part of your fail state here. So let's talk about some lists. The first one is Cool Stuff KO, an Endrin Master, a Knight Relictor, and then the Scarvet on Agridon, who I think is awesome. And 7 Arcanauts. Now, the Scarvet on Agridon is like almost good enough for competitive play, in my opinion, but he's perfect for cool stuff play because he is pretty good. There's just other things in the game that are better and cost similar points, but he is pretty good, and that's perfect for this. Arcanauts are really cool with a Knight Relictor because they can sit in his bubble and then attack out of the bubble, which is a really nice place to be. And also because they're 12 wounds, 4-8 profiles all of a sudden have kind of a tough time getting there. Normally 4-8 profiles are actually really scary for dwarves, but with a Knight Relictor there, all of a sudden 4-8 profiles don't count to 12 nearly as well. You also get to play the Scarvet. So this becomes kind of this double cool thing. I'm actually thinking about buying an Endrin Master and a Scarvet just so I can run this because I do have 7 Arcanauts. But the Scarvet does a lot that the rest of this warband doesn't do. It's very fast. It gives you burst damage. Arcanauts are actually kind of nice for slow damage over time and being able to put the damage where they want to. But what they don't do is take something out in one hit, which is an incredibly valuable thing to be able to do. One, because your opponent can't react to it. As soon as you shoot one thing with an Arcanaut, and say you manage to get a crit and you deal 3 damage to it, now your opponent knows that that's the thing all the Arcanauts are going to shoot, and they can kind of react to that. They can go tie up other Arcanauts. They can run the thing that you're shooting away. They get a lot of time to kind of decide how they're going to deal with the damage over time that the Arcanauts give you. And so a Scarvet just completely goes the opposite direction, which is a really nice place to be. So this is a list that I think is actually pretty decent. It's not going to be the most competitive thing you can run, but this is the kind of list that you can take to a tournament, win some games, and feel like you're playing your really cool, sweet pet fighters in a really fun way. Speaking for the trees, this one is probably a little bit less powerful, mostly just because I think Sylvaneth are just in a less powerful place than KO right now. But you get a Kurnoth Huntmaster with sword, you get this Knight Relictor, you get a Warden King, you get Kurnoth Hunter with sword, 3 Spite Revenants, and a Tree Revenant. So first of all, this is a list that will absolutely satisfy any kind of ability soup lover. Your Tree Revenant has a crazy teleport. Your Spite Revenants have their nets. Your Warden King has it will be necessary to pass on the body, which is that wild objective play thing. And then the Kurnoth Hunters have a pretty bad ability, but that's okay. You also have your Knight Relictor, of course, with the triple. The ability is actually really nice with kind of low toughness, high wound fighters like Kurnoths because it takes a lot of hits to get them. The ability is actually really just nice for helping low toughness things in general because it nerfs hits. It doesn't nerf attack dice, if that makes sense. So the sort of mathematically, it benefits low wound fighters more than it benefits high wound fighters or low strength fighters more than low toughness fighters more. I'm leaving this in. Anyway, Kurnoth hunters become very difficult to kill with a Knight Relictor on the battlefield. They're very difficult to one-shot, extremely difficult to one-shot, which means that actually losing initiative if what your opponent needs to do is kill a Kurnoth hunter or a Hunt Master or even the Warden King, if what they need to do is kill one of those 3 important pieces in your warband, they're probably not going to kill it on their first attack step, which means they're going to need follow-up attacks, which means no matter what, even if you lose initiative, you're going to be able to get your Knight Relictor into position to protect your important pieces, which is what the Knight Relictor is here to do, right? Exactly. So that's a really good little place of synergy there. And then your Spite Revenants can disrupt some of those 4-8 fighters just because they have nets. And nets are okay to have. So this is a warband that I think would be just very, very playable. It wouldn't be a top competitive thing, but it would just be very playable. And you could use your Knight Relictor. Here he is. I keep him by my desk because I love him so much. Literally, I mean, this is like my favorite model that I've never put on the table because he's not very good. But these are some lists that would be functional with him. I actually recently bought a dwarf with a huge hammer to be my Warden King so that I can play this. I also need to buy Spite Revenants. I don't have any of these pieces, but I want to because I want to play him. And this was a really fun exercise because I've been wanting to play him for a while, so I finally put in the work and figured I'd share it. That was the whole impetus for this whole video. Now I want to do a cool theme, not just one cool fighter who I think is cool and probably most other people don't. I know a lot of people like the Gaba Paloa. Brugit was eye-rolling people for a long time, but it's been nerfed. So let's talk about setup. Cool thing about the Gaba Paloa, no setup needed. That's a major strength of theirs. Each Gaba Paloa member, their ability comes out in a different way. And so basically, no matter what the situation, there's some ability from one of the Gaba Paloa that's going to be useful. Now, the issue there is you do want dice. That'll be in the weaknesses area, but this is a major strength, is that you really get to set them up however you want. They're doing stuff no matter what. What they actually do, some of their abilities accelerate allies, and some of their abilities disrupt specific opposing fighters. So they have like single target disruption stuff. Both are very interesting and both are kind of cool, but those are kind of the 2 things they do. The other thing they do is they provide a group of pretty survivable bodies for objectives. All of them, maybe except for the Brugit, have a pretty reasonable wound stat for their points, which is a great place to be, right? It means that they're not very cheap, but for 410 for 5 models, this kind of starts you in a place where you can at least like stand on objectives and not die right away, which is a great place to be. Their weaknesses, and here I've got the actual profiles with their abilities here that you can read. Their biggest weaknesses, none of them are any good at attacking. For the most part, chaff models are actually really good at attacking. Their attacks just add up, and as long as chaff models aren't getting one shot off the board, they actually do a lot of work. The Gaba Paloa are not going to do a lot of work. Even something like the Scaremonger, you might see some numbers like 4 for crit and 4 for attacks, but with strength 2 and just 1, I mean, you're just fishing for 6s, and if you don't roll a 6, you're really disappointed. And even if you roll 8 dice and you only roll 1 6, that's not a very impressive attack either for a 90-point fighter. So this is what we're talking about, is it's just hard to put damage out with the Gaba Paloa, and they all have that strength 2, which is so annoying. Because it means that they can't really fight chaff v chaff battles because they even hit opposing cheap guys on 5s, which is just a terrible place to be. So that means all of your offense needs to come from the other 590 points of your warband, which is just something to know if you're going to play a bunch of Gaba Paloa people. The fail state for these guys is you have a bunch of dudes standing around awkwardly, not using their abilities. So basically, if you have bad initiative rolls, for example, a triple and 3 singles is really bad for you because you probably should be up spending a dice to upgrade your triple to a rampage. You should probably be rampaging with one of those fighters that are giving you your offense, which means that your Gabapalooza aren't doing crazy cool things. That's a tough place to be. So that's really your fail state is, I mean, triple 3 singles is like a truly awful roll to get. And it happens like, I think it's like high 20s%. Like it happens reasonably often in Warcry. Maybe it's not high 20s. Maybe it's like 1 in 4. But yeah, it happens. And it's a terrible place to be for the Gabapalooza. So you really want those, like the most common initiative roll, which is 2 doubles, 2 singles. That can be a nice one to have if you can roll a natural full house, something like that. So you can really fail with them if your initiative rolls are not what you want. So let's get into a list with all of the Gabapalooza. I've got a Bounder boss because it benefits from both of the sort of ally targeting buffs pretty well. And it's got speed because none of the Gabapalooza are fast. I've got a Crusher here because 4/8 damage profiles really do nicely with Brugit. I've got a Sneaky Snuffler. I didn't want to put a Netta here, although you certainly could put a Netter in here. Because what I like about the Gabapalooza is that your lowest wound stat is 12. Nothing is easily one-shottable. If the opponent has fighters who really want to be getting an easy kill early in the game, I don't want to give them any target for that. And so a Netter just dies and scores people points for getting a kill, or scores like procs abilities that you really don't want your opponent to be able to proc early in round 2 or even in round 1. You just don't want that. Usually in a warband, you have some really easy killable fighters, but that's because you're spamming a million of them and you're getting other benefits to that. The Gabapalooza is not a spam strategy. There's just not enough of them for it, right? This is an 8 model warband. It's not an 11 model warband. And so because of that, I just don't want any super killable fighters. And so that's why I've got the Sneaky Snuffler, even though normally you would see the Netter in competitive play more often than the Snuffler. The Crusher is amazing. So this is kind of just... I don't need to talk about the Crusher more. It was nerfed for a reason in the last meta watch, but it's really good as both a Brugit target and the why am I blanking on his name? Is it the Shroomancer who does it? No, is it the Spiker who does it? Yeah, it's the Spiker who can give plus strength. So I wasn't worried. Normally, I don't love topping out at strength 5 because there's a lot of toughness 6 out there. But you can pump strength with the Spiker, and so strength 5 is fine. And so you have your offense, your speed coming from the Bounder boss and the Crusher, which lets the Gabapalooza really thrive, and that's kind of how I build around them. So hopefully these 2 examples of the Night Relictor and the Gabapalooza kind of give you an idea of what I mean as far as all the esoteric theory that I started with, now moving into more specific things there. So hopefully that was fun. Let me know what the cool fighter that you really wish that you could put on the table is. Hopefully this video has sort of helped you do that. And when you do play that cool fighter, may all your rolls be crits.